Hello, everybody. My name is Bob Abbey. I'm Adult Services Librarian for the City of Forest Grove. I'd like to welcome you to our program this evening with Taylor Stewart, the Oregon Remembrance Project. The topic is, how do you reconcile a lynching? Taylor's going to be talking about Alonzo Tucker and also his own personal journey to understanding the history of lynching and also the connection between lynching and capital punishment and the death penalty. We're really pleased to have Taylor with us tonight. I want to remind you also about a program that we have next week. Dr. Donna Sinclair, who is a Portland-based historian and writer, is going to be online with us to talk about her 2020 book called Black Woman in Green, Gloria Brown and the Unmarked Trail to Forest Service Leadership. It's a fascinating story about Gloria Brown, who worked through the ranks of the forest system to become the first woman of color in a leadership position. So that will be next week, Tuesday the 15th, also at 6:30 here as a live stream. Before I bring Taylor in, I do want to acknowledge our generous underwriters for this program: Oregon Humanities, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Oregon Cultural Trust, the Standard, and Stoll Reeves LLP. They have helped make this program possible. We are very grateful for them in making this possible. So I'm going to bring Taylor in and introduce him. Before I do, though, I just want to say a word about tonight's program. This is a difficult topic, and it may traumatize, and it may create very strong feelings for you as you watch. I would encourage you, in order to be present in this conversation, to take care of yourself and be very mindful of how this topic and how these images are affecting you. So please be mindful of that. We want you to be here with us, but we also want you to take care of yourself. So I'm going to bring Taylor on. Hi, Taylor.
Hi, Bob. It's a pleasure to be with you here this evening.
Well, we're so happy to have you with us, and to hear your work with the Oregon Remembrance Project. I should mention that you founded the Oregon Remembrance Project in 2018, not long after you graduated from the University of Portland. Is that correct?
Yes, indeed. I'll tell you a little bit about, I took a trip after my time at UP, and that's really what got me started to where I am today.
Great. So the format of the program tonight, Taylor's going to do his presentation, and then I'm going to come in and he and I will chat a little bit. This is an interactive program. I do invite you to post your comments and questions. If you're watching on Facebook, you can do that in the comment box. If you're watching on YouTube, you do need to have a YouTube account in order to do that. But please feel free to do that at any time. And then we'll also have some time at the end of the program to field those questions as well. So, Taylor, I'm going to bring on your presentation, and it's all ready for you. And then I will back out and I'll see you at the end of the presentation.
Great. Hello, everyone. My name is Taylor Stewart, and I'm pleased to be speaking with you here this evening. 3.5 years ago, I was faced with the question, how do you reconcile a lynching? How do you find justice for historical injustice? Well, 3.5 years later, I believe I finally have the answer. This story starts the summer after I graduated college in 2018. I went on this trip called the Civil Rights Immersion, where we went to various locations of historical significance. We traveled to Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas. I was especially looking forward to the portion of the trip where we'd be going to Montgomery because we had plans to see the new Equal Justice Initiative museums. You see, I was a big fan of Brian Stevenson, the executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative, and I'd heard about these museums in one of my college classes. In April 2018, the Equal Justice Initiative opened up 2 museums. The first was the Legacy Museum, which chronicles the link between slavery and mass incarceration with the belief that slavery didn't end in 1865, it just evolved. The second was the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, or the Lynching Museum. The Equal Justice Initiative has documented nearly 6,500 lynchings of African Americans between the years of 1865 to 1950. When you enter the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, you are confronted with these 6-foot-high pillars that have the name of the state, the name of the county, and then the names of everyone who was lynched in that county. I had always known about lynching in the abstract, but to actually read the names of people who were lynched in this country made this history personal. I had no idea the magnitude of it all. Name after name after name. What got me most was seeing names with the last name Stewart, knowing that simply time and place separated me from the name on that pillar. As you make your way through the museum, the pillars, which are originally perpendicular to the floor, begin to come off the ground until finally they are hanging above you. There's something powerful about having to crane your neck backwards to continue reading the names, causing you to visualize the way many of the victims of lynching died. As you continue, you begin to learn more about what was the culture of lynching in America. You learn that minor social transgressions could get you lynched. You learn that asking for a fair price in trade could get you lynched. You learn that sometimes when the white mob couldn't find who they were looking for, they would simply lynch an innocent bystander. When you stand in the center of the museum, you are surrounded by the pillars, symbolizing the crowd that was so frequently present at these events. At this spot in the center, our tour guide told us about her hometown. This was a small town in Alabama. In this small town, businesses close early on Wednesdays. Not your big stores like Walmart or Walgreens, but your local stores, your ma and pa stores. They close early on Wednesdays because that's just tradition. Well, that tradition started so that everyone could make it to the lynchings on time because lynchings were held on Wednesdays. And despite the history of that tradition, businesses still close early on Wednesdays in this small Alabama town. I was awestruck. The National Memorial for Peace and Justice was the most heartbreaking part of our trip. I couldn't believe that no one had ever told me about lynching in America before. I couldn't believe that I had gone 22 years in this country knowing nothing about this history, and most importantly, I couldn't believe that no one was talking about this. Why do we not talk about lynching in America? We talk about 9/11 as America's first experience with terrorism, but that's simply not true. There had long been an era of domestic terrorism in the United States, nearly 6,500 lynchings. That's more than just nearly 6,500 individuals. That's nearly 6,500 times the entire African American community sustained an act of domestic terrorism, all in less than 100 years. This should really alter our perception of what life was like in America at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. Lynching left thousands of African Americans dead, imposed racial subordination, forced the exodus of millions from the South, and diminished African Americans in this country's social, political, and economic life in ways that can still be felt today. Visiting the National Memorial for Peace and Justice was a profound encounter with history for me, an encounter that I wanted to bring home and share. Luckily, in conjunction with the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, the Equal Justice Initiative also started the Community Remembrance Project. The Community Remembrance Project aims to work in the communities where the lynchings of African Americans took place to find healing and reconciliation through a sober reflection on history. I had lived in Oregon my entire life, And I couldn't believe that I had to go all the way to Montgomery, Alabama, just to learn that an African American man named Alonzo Tucker was lynched in Coos Bay, Oregon in 1902. There is an interest form online about getting involved with the Community Remembrance Project. Now, I would love to say that when I first saw that, I was immediately like, sign me up. How can I help? But that wouldn't be true. In fact, I was too nervous to fill out the interest form. After all, this was the Equal Justice Initiative, and I was a recent college grad with no relevant experience. I figured, who am I to really think that I could be of any help? So I decided I wasn't going to fill out the interest form. But thankfully, two encounters from the rest of my trip inspired me to change my mind. The first was a quote from John Lewis, longtime civil rights icon and congressman from Georgia, who asked, "If not us, then who? If not now, then when?" This taught me the fierce urgency of now. The second was the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. Here, they just focused on Mississippi history. So there was no mention of Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, individuals who we kind of deify and are hard to relate to. Instead, the museum told the story of everyday Mississippians who did their part to pave the way for justice. And so, there at the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum is where I learned that you don't have to be an extraordinary person to do extraordinary things. And so those two encounters gave me the courage to reach out to the Equal Justice Initiative, and 3.5 years later, here we are. I'll talk a little bit more later about what we did in Coos Bay. As for now, I am here to tell you what I wish was told to me, so that when you go to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice one day, you won't have to say, "How come no one ever told me about lynching before?" I am here to tell you about the legacy of lynching, how we can find reconciliation, and how lynching is still a relevant topic to us today. Because despite what we may like to think, lynching was not the work of a few hooded vigilantes. Whole communities participated in the ritualistic killing of African Americans. The legacy of lynching was not hidden away in the shadows of the night. The legacy of lynching was broadcast in broad daylight on the courthouse lawn. The era of lynching may be behind us, but we as a nation won't ever be able to move past it until we confront this legacy. Lynching was domestic terrorism. And in this era of domestic terrorism, African Americans had to live under the constant fear that their actions could result in a lynching. White individuals accused of identical violations of law or custom were rarely subjected to the same fate. Lynching increasingly became a racialized tool of oppression over the African American population. This history should make us all feel uncomfortable. The barbarity, impunity, and spectacle of lynching are difficult to grapple with. What's most horrifying is the celebration of lynching, the way it was exalted in the white community. When you see pictures of lynchings, it's not the black bodies that are most disturbing, it's the sea of white faces looking on that are most ominous. The way they smile, the way they lean into frame, I know no greater depths of the depravity of humanity than lynching in America. Black suffering became white entertainment. So, what precipitated lynching? Well, a variety of things. One of the most common was the accusation of sexual assault, which was largely driven by the pervasive fear of interracial sex. During this time period, the mere accusation of rape was enough to incite a mob, and any action that could remotely be interpreted as a black man seeking sexual contact with a white woman was subject to this pervasive fear. Something as innocuous as a black man accidentally bumping into a white woman could result in the accusation of sexual assault. This would be because the myth of the black male rapist permeated society, as it was a widely held belief at the time that white women couldn't willingly consent to sex with black men. When famed anti-lynching advocate Ida B. Wells challenged this myth about lynching and asserted that when in fact there was a charge of rape, in many instances it was really a consensual relationship, a mob burned down her newspaper and threatened to lynch her. More than half of the Equal Justice Initiative documented lynching victims during the Jim Crow era were killed under some accusation of committing murder or rape. We cannot overstate the way the deep racial hostility of the time inspired increased suspicion on the Black community whenever a crime was discovered, even when little evidence tied the accused to the crime. Minstrel shows, racial science, and the racist chromolithography of the 20th century embedded in the minds of white America the presumption of Black guilt and attributed this to their perceived moral inferiority. However, it wasn't just accusations of a crime that resulted in lynching. Violating the rules of the social order also had fatal consequences. There was a saying at the time that what the law cannot do, the noose can. African Americans were lynched for things like speaking disrespectfully to a white person, refusing to step off the sidewalk, reprimanding white children, arguing with a white man, and other perceived social infractions. African Americans had to live with the constant knowledge that they could be lynched whether they intentionally or unintentionally violated social norms. And it was this violence that maintained and enforced the racial stratification of the Jim Crow era. I personally cannot imagine what it was like to be Black and to have to travel into the white part of town knowing the slightest misstep could get you killed at any moment. But even more than that, I can't imagine going into the white community with the knowledge that that community was capable of a public spectacle lynching. These were festive community rituals that manifested a sinister component of the American identity. These were loud and rambunctious events akin to a sporting event. The roar of the crowd, the deafening boos, and the exuberant jubilation for a victim that finally met their fate incentivized fans to participate in this great American recreation. What I tell people is to remember what it was like the very first time you saw the video of George Floyd, to remember how sick it made you feel to watch someone plead for their life as that life was being taken away from them. But then to imagine that rather than feeling sick, you found that video pleasurable. Not only that, imagine you found it so pleasurable that you would get together with your friends so that you could all enjoy the video together. Imagine getting a whole crowd of people together on that Minneapolis street so that you could all be there live for the killing of George Floyd, because that's what public spectacle lynchings were like. Public spectacle lynchings were those in which large numbers of people, sometimes in the thousands, gathered to witness the pre-planned killing of an African American in a manner that included prolonged torture, dismemberment, and or burning of the victim. These were carnival-like events that included food vendors, photographs, and the selling of body parts. It was especially popular at that time to take a picture of the lynching that would then be turned into a postcard that could then be distributed to friends, family, or merely kept as a souvenir. Young children would collect the kindling that they would use for the fire to burn victims alive, and as those children got older, it became a rite of passage into adulthood to take a more active role in this community ritual. Sometimes the mob would joke with one another how they were going to distribute the lynching victim's body parts in front of the lynching victim while they were still alive. And those body parts would then be kept as cherished family heirlooms and passed from one generation to the next. Public spectacle lynchings were brazen, celebratory acts of sadism that implicated the whole white community and sent a clear message that Blacks were undeserving of even the slightest bit of human dignity. This would be because lynching was always meant to send a message. Lynching was about much more than simply killing someone. It was meant to terrorize. You know, my biggest takeaway from the first week of the Derek Chauvin trial was how traumatized the bystanders were from George Floyd's murder. Witnessing that level of callous violence has left an indelible impact on the psyche of these individuals, and they will live with this PTSD for the rest of their lives. I can't even begin to imagine the trauma that resulted from white mobs forcing other Black people to witness lynchings. Some mobs would specifically harness this terror and disrupt any feelings of safety in one's community by conducting their lynchings within the Black part of town, and many other times dragging the body of a lynching victim behind a car throughout the Black community to continually instill this fear. And in the face of this terror, sometimes Black people were lynched simply for asserting their own humanity. The targets of these lynchings were frequently sharecroppers, ministers, and community leaders who resisted mistreatment or espoused Black advancement beyond the confines of the Jim Crow era. These are the lynchings that bother me the most, because if I were doing this work 100 years ago, I would probably be one of these lynching victims. Lynching became a tool to keep African Americans in a state of subjugation and repress African Americans' fight for economic power and equal rights during the 19th and 20th centuries. It is difficult to fathom what life must have been like for African Americans living during this time. One can even begin to understand the collective trauma associated with these events, having to watch your friends, your family, your community lynched over and over again. We talk about how difficult it was on the Black community to see Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd all killed in such quick succession. I can't even imagine the psychological toll that would have taken had those all been brutal lynchings. I believe we must pay witness to this era of domestic terrorism. We cannot say enough about the psychological wounds inflicted on the African American community, nor can we understate the psychological damage the white community passed on from generation to generation in this socialization of violence. Nor can we ignore our state institutions' indifference and complicity of lynching. And so, as we talk about lynching today, I am here to tell you that we are not as far removed from lynching culture as we would like to think. Because if we really want to see how lynching has survived, we need not look further than the American death penalty. Our death penalty is the most direct legacy of lynching, because at the same time lynchings in the United States were going down, executions were going up. Lynching simply moved indoors, where all white juries and expedited trials carried out the same verdict as the lynch mob. During the 1930s, 2/3 of all executions in the United States were of African Americans. Between the years of 1910 to 1950, while only making up 22% of the South's population, African Americans accounted for 75% of all of those who were executed in this region, and this disproportionality continues to today, where African Americans make up 13% of the population, but 41% of those who are on death row. And when you consider the fact that of that 41%, nearly all are African American males, yet African American males only make up 6.5% of our population, we have to ask ourselves, how do we get from 6.5 to 41%? The color of your skin still plays a crucial role in whether our society believes you deserve death or not. When we look at someone and are comfortable saying, you deserve to die, that decision is tainted by racial bias. In 2014, there was a study out of the University of Washington that looked at jurors in Washington state and found that jurors were 3 times more likely to recommend a death sentence for a Black defendant than for a white defendant accused of similar crimes. Nearly every study that has looked at the issue of race of victim and capital punishment sentencing has found that you are more likely to get the death sentence if the victim is white. This is especially true if the defendant is black. We still treat the accusation of black on white crime differently. Between 1930 to 1972, 455 individuals in the United States were executed for the charge of rape, and 89% were African American. No white man in the history of the United States has ever been executed for the rape of a black woman or girl in a non-homicide offense. Ever. Of the 316 individuals who have been executed since 1976 for an interracial homicide, 93% have been about black on white crime. Our society still makes little secret over whose life has value and whose does not. Of the 186 individuals who have been exonerated from death row since 1976, meaning individuals who were wrongfully arrested, wrongfully convicted, wrongfully put in prison, wrongfully put on death row, over half have been African American. We are still trying to kill innocent black people. In Arkansas, it was recently discovered that the DNA on a murder weapon did not match that of an African American man who had maintained his innocence over the 22 years he was in prison. Only problem is, Arkansas executed this man in 2017. The states in the South, plus Oklahoma and Missouri, had the highest number of lynchings, and since 1976, those states alone have accounted for 86% of all executions in the United States. The same region of the country that lynched is the same region of the country that executes. We are too busy asking ourselves the question, does this person deserve to die for their crimes, that we haven't first asked ourselves the question, do we deserve to kill? Because if the answer is no, then it doesn't matter what the answer is to that first question. Did you know Germany doesn't have the death penalty? Germany knows that given their history, it would be unconscionable for the country of Germany to systematically execute its citizens, especially if a disproportionate number of those citizens were Jewish. The world would be in outrage. We in the United States would be outraged if that were the case. So where is that same outrage when, given our history, the United States systematically executes its citizens and a disproportionate number of those citizens are African American? Where is the outrage when, given our history as a state, a disproportionate number of African Americans sit on Oregon's death row? Where is the outrage? Because I don't hear it. The moral outrage of future generations is hypocritical. We condemn the institution of lynching while failing to condemn its legacy. Everyone wants to say that if they had been around during the lynching era, they wouldn't have stood by. They would have said something. They would have done something. Well, I can tell you, lynching is still going on. You're still standing by, still not saying anything, still not doing anything. We are burdened by our history of injustice, but more importantly, we are burdened by our history of repeating injustice. However, I am here to tell you that it doesn't have to be this way. We have the power to recreate our relationship with history and rewrite the ending to history's stories. That's what we tried to do in Coos Bay, Oregon. Our collective memory and our collective consciousness hold power. What we choose to remember, as well as how we choose to remember history, is a reflection of the soul of our society. We cannot change the past, but we can always change our relationship to the past. So, for 3 years, I worked with the community of Coos Bay to engage in the requisite truth-telling required to get to reconciliation. This truth-telling began on February 29, 2020, with a soil collection ceremony for 28-year-old Alonzo Tucker near the spot where he was killed. we collected 2 jars of soil, one that was sent back to the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, and the other that is now on display at the Coos History Museum. Hidden in this soil was the story of Alonzo Tucker. The soil was gathered from 3 locations, and each bit of soil tells part of Alonzo Tucker's story. The first bit was gathered from underneath the mudflats of the local docks, where Alonzo Tucker spent the night hiding from a mob that had formed to lynch him after he had been accused of sexually assaulting a white woman. The second bit of soil was gathered from Front Street, where Alonzo Tucker was repeatedly shot and left incapacitated before a noose was placed around his neck and he was thrown in the back of a cart with the intention of lynching him from the spot of the alleged assault. However, they wouldn't make it that far, as Alonzo Tucker would die from the gunshot wound. So the third bit of soil was gathered from where the old Marshfield Bridge used to be, which is where the mob strung up Alonzo Tucker's dead body from a light pole in front of a crowd of 300. Even children were a part of the lynch mob that left Alonzo Tucker's body hanging there for several hours. Despite this all occurring in broad daylight without a masked man in the crowd, no one would ever be held accountable for the lynching of Alonzo Tucker. News of this lynching made headlines across Oregon, and most newspapers openly sympathized with the lynch mob. Following this event, African Americans would then flee the Coos Bay area over fears of future violence. In 1974, a Coos Bay World newspaper reporter interviewed 3 white men who were boys at the time of the 1902 lynching, and they provided eyewitness accounts. All 3 men believed Alonzo Tucker was lynched over a consensual relationship with the woman who accused him of assault. We began this truth-telling work with the soil ceremony, and we continued that work by permanently installing this history into the geographic memory of Oregon. On June 19, 2021, we unveiled an Equal Justice Initiative historical marker in Coos Bay to memorialize Alonzo Tucker and the thousands of other African Americans who were lynched in this country. This visible acknowledgement serves to memorialize Alonzo Tucker in the collective memory and collective consciousness of Coos Bay. Alonzo Tucker's life may have ended from a light pole on the Marshfield Bridge, but that's not where his story now ends. At the unveiling ceremony, we had over 600 people, double that who were at the 1902 lynching, paying witness to this injustice as we meaningfully added a new chapter to Alonzo Tucker's story. By giving voice to this story in such a permanent way, we hope to get closer to reconciling our relationship with history. However, we find reconciliation for this lynching not by our acts of remembrance, but by how those acts of remembrance change us. We find reconciliation not by our knowledge of lynching, but by what we do with that knowledge. We find reconciliation not by reflecting solely on the past, but by critically evaluating the present. So, how do you reconcile a lynching? It starts with remembrance, then it moves to repair. And we must repair the fundamental question of who our society believes deserves death, because the answer continues to be disproportionately African American. Public remembrance only goes so far. It requires action in the present day to repair the harms of the past, and I don't believe we can truly find reconciliation for lynching until we put an end to the heir to its legacy, the death penalty. 3.5 years ago, I set out to reconcile the lynching of Alonzo Tucker, and that is still my goal. I've just learned along the way that it's going to take more than a few acts of remembrance. The Oregon Supreme Court recently overturned the death sentence of an inmate due to the 2019 passage of Senate Bill 1013, which limited the scope of offenses eligible for the death penalty. It is likely that the remaining 23 death sentences will similarly be overturned, and so, while this ruling and Senate Bill 1013 make the death penalty nearly non-existent in Oregon, there must still remain an urgency for a full repeal. Oregon voters are the only ones with the power to ultimately end the death penalty by voting to remove it from our state constitution. While in many ways it will be symbolic, symbolism matters and reflects the type of society that we want to be. It was symbolic. In 1926, when Oregon repealed its Black exclusionary laws, it was symbolic. In 1973, when Oregon ratified the 15th Amendment, and it was symbolic. In 1973, when Oregon ratified the 15th Amendment. While symbolic, these actions matter to history, and it matters to the memory of Alonzo Tucker that we still have a death penalty. I accept the things that I cannot change, and I change the things that I cannot accept and I cannot accept. Race being the largest predictive factor in capital punishment sentencing. I cannot accept the continuation of lynching, and most importantly, I cannot accept that no one is talking about this. So, I need your help to reconcile the lynching of Alonzo Tucker because I can't do it by myself. I need your help to end the death penalty in Oregon because the answer to the question of what would you have done had you been around during the lynching era is what are you doing about lynching right now? So, there are 3 things you can do to help this cause. First, follow the Oregon Remembrance Project on social media, Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. Second, share the death penalty conversation slides that you can find on the Oregon Remembrance Project's website. But third, and most importantly, I just need you to tell someone about lynching and the death penalty. We end the death penalty in Oregon one conversation at a time, and I'm imploring you to start these conversations because our failure to confront the origins of systemic injustice is what has allowed those injustices to evolve. People ask me if I really think this connection between lynching and the death penalty will change hearts and minds. Well, let me tell you, I know it does because it changed my mind. I wasn't always this person. I grew up in a conservative, white, evangelical environment, and I was a product of that environment. I missed out on one of the most important days of my life in 2008 when Barack Obama was elected the first Black president of the United States because had I been old enough, I would have voted for John McCain and Sarah Palin. I graduated high school a registered Republican with the dream of becoming a tough on crime prosecutor. I used to be a passionate supporter of the death penalty. I gave a speech my junior year of college in favor of capital punishment, and I'm not that old, so that wasn't that long ago. But then I learned about lynching, and I learned about its connection to the death penalty, and I realized that there is no justice unless there's equal justice. Equal justice under law. That's what it says on the Supreme Court. But our system that we depend upon to dispense the most ultimate form of justice is too flawed to produce anything but injustice. I would say it's broken, but it's functioning exactly the way it was intended as a replacement for lynching. We lose hope when we stop believing individuals and communities can change, so I choose to remain hopeful. You may not think you can make a meaningful difference, but I believe you can. One conversation at a time, one friend at a time, one community at a time. I believe that you can be a part of a grassroots movement to repair the harms of the past and end the death penalty in Oregon. It just takes the political will. I learned from my trip to the South that it's okay to believe in something even when you've never seen it before. And it's okay to see something even when others don't believe in it. 3.5 years ago, people thought I was crazy for thinking I could put a historical marker about lynching in Coos Bay, Oregon. But I'm an optimist. I believe that no matter where you go, you can find enough people who are willing to choose justice if given the opportunity. It's just a matter of getting them to see where there's been injustice. If I've learned anything, it's that it's less about being the right person for the moment as it is about doing the right thing for the moment. Even Martin Luther King Jr. didn't think he was the right person for the moment, but he acted anyway because he knew it was the right thing to do. On December 5th, 1955, a little-known pastor accepted the nomination to become president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, gave his first large public address, and the rest is history. Stepping into that moment is what made him the right person, so I'm asking you to step with me into this moment. When I was younger, I used to think that it was remarkable people that did remarkable things. However, the older I've gotten, the more I've realized that it's remarkable things that make remarkable people. And I believe that you can be a part of something that's remarkable. Don't underestimate your ability to be the change you want to see in this world, because let me tell you, you don't have to be an extraordinary person to do extraordinary things. Thank you.
Thank you, Taylor, for sharing your personal journey with us and for sharing the work that you're doing with the Oregon Remembrance Project. I've pasted the links to the Oregon Remembrance Project Facebook page and Instagram account, and also to their website. So those are in the comment section. So please visit and support. You mentioned that you grew up knowing very little of this history, and I suspect most everyone who's watching would probably say the same. I'm a little bit older than you, and I can tell you that I never heard anything about this. We're currently seeing efforts around the country to eliminate discussions of race and systemic racism in the classroom. And I'm wondering, how do we as citizens, community members, and parents ensure that the next generation of students don't carry this ignorance with them?
I would say that it starts with rethinking what our relationship is to the emotion of grief. This history and much of our histories of racial injustice create this feeling of grief, this sadness over this history. But grief in and of itself isn't an unproductive emotion. Grief is only an unproductive emotion if it doesn't inspire us to move towards action. And so this feeling, this negative feeling that we get from this history can really be shaped into something positive. And so I think that when we have these conversations on education of history in schools, so much of it is what do we do when we get to this feeling of grief, this negative feeling? And in many parts, the solution is just to avoid that feeling altogether. But that feeling is what really inspires and has inspired action across our nation's history. And so I think it starts with how do we sit in discomfort, and what do we do from there? Do we either move towards trying to never feel that discomfort? Or do we sort of move towards a place of using that discomfort to sort of spur us towards action, try and rectify the thing that initially started that discomfort?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the issue of discomfort is one of the frames that is surrounding this discussion, that we want to eliminate that discomfort entirely because of the feelings that it might generate. And it sounds like you're arguing that discomfort is an essential part of that reparation and repairing, right? That you have to be in that.
I think that if we approached it as, rather than avoiding this discomfort, but how do we move to a place of healing, that positive, and through that to engage in that healing is where we get to that action, that repair. And so I think that we can funnel this feeling towards a productive means, but it does take courage to do so. And so I think what we need to work on is both how do we relate to this feeling of grief, but how can we find inspiration to have that courage to move towards those directions of productivity.
Mhm. You raised some interesting issues of the historical context, and I'd like to spend a couple of minutes and dwell in that area. The harm that lynching did to Black communities, I think, is one that we might not think too much about. And one of the things that struck me as I was looking at the images you shared is that we see these crowds, we see the townsfolk, we see the people, and yet we very rarely see the faces of the people who are lynched. And that aspect of anonymity is, I think, another harm that happens to the Black community, because these are individuals who are part of that community. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the harm that lynching does to Black communities?
Yeah, um, some of the images that I use, I try to hide the face to create that. These are difficult images to have your last moment splattered across American history, but to also uh, sort of show that those Black bodies really aren't the most disturbing picture. And that, at least what the images that are seared into my mind aren't the memories of their bodies, but the sea of white faces. And it's those faces that are really sort of the lasting impression from these images. And so, I think about. I remember during the year of 2020, the real tangible psychological burden that it had to be reading on my phone, and you're like, oh great, some innocent African American man was jogging in Georgia, and he was hunted down and killed, and you're like, wow, you're like, how do we deal with that? And then I remember a few weeks later, you're like, oh, an African American woman was killed in her sleep in Louisville, Kentucky. And then you fast forward a little bit, and then you're like, I just watched an African American man have his life sapped from him in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I remember actually getting sick. Sometimes, at least for me personally, when there's high amounts of stress, my body reacts in sickness. And I remember being sick, tangibly sick for 1 or 2 days because of the sort of psychological weight of what has all been unfolding, and the sort of how do you and there's this difficulty for those in the racial justice movement during that 2020 period of how do I process my own grief while also trying to help lead others towards some sort of semblance of action. And so it was it was a difficult time in life, and I can not even really fathom the burden, the weight that this legacy of lynching had on African Americans in the United States. I think about the burden that the lynching of Emmett Till had on the civil rights movement, and it sort of spurring this action. And so, that was sort of the feelings going on of there is this trauma. How do you process it? But as you sort of look back to the history and specifically the sort of the case of Emmett Till, how can we, while we're at our lowest, still find that same resiliency to sort of push us forward? And so have experienced that difficulty in a minute scale, that it has really given me a new perspective on what African Americans must have had to deal with during the late 19th, earliest 20th century.
Mm-hmm. You also talk about the very nature of lynching and how it often would be an arbitrary act, a reaction for something as simple as brushing up against someone. That certainly had to have had a tremendous impact on the Black community as well. That sense of never really knowing what might set someone off. The other piece about this that I think is really interesting is and you touched on this so well and with such eloquence, is the nature of the community involvement and the community complicity in acts of lynching, and those images of children standing by and taking part in these horrific acts. I wonder how that complicity squares with the sense that I think we feel and we hear a lot, that this wasn't my problem. These weren't my family members. I wasn't around then, right? So the sense that because I wasn't there or my family members didn't live in Coos Bay, this is not my problem. But I think it's hard to exonerate an entire community when you see these images. What are your thoughts on that sense of community complicity and being able to just sort of give yourself a pass?
Yeah, it's a little bit cliche, but I think a lot of it comes back to the Martin Luther King quote of "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And so, when we think about the lynchings that occurred during the 19th, 20th century, we don't necessarily be like, oh, well, that predominantly happened in the South. We give the North and the West a pass because they were still complicit in the acceptance of it. And even if you weren't going to the weekend lynching, you were still a part of the culture that allowed it to happen. Sometimes silence is the loudest voice in the room. And the only thing necessary for injustice to prevail is the silence of good men. And so it is that silence and inability to interject when injustice is present that I think is still very much relatable to what is going on today. And so, the vast majority of executions in the United States still occur in the same region of the country that lynched. And so the sort of, well, what can I do about that here in Oregon? And it really starts with being a part of ending that legacy in our own home state. So that we can hopefully build and be a part of this national movement to end the death penalty across the United States. And so, one of my favorite quotes is from Cory Booker. And it's, don't let your inability to do everything stop you from doing one thing. And sometimes these systems, these histories of injustice can be overwhelming. And, like for me personally, I can't solve the whole injustice of the legal system. But what I can work on is this one issue in particular. And I can, by doing that, go around telling folks about it. I was inspired from my trip to the South to hear about this legacy of lynching. And I was like, I need to tell people about this. And so that's what I've done. And that's sort of what's brought me here today. And, I go back 3.5 years, may not have felt like I could make a big difference. But just sort of doing those small things, getting involved where you feel called, and having those conversations, especially here in Oregon, where the actual way to end the death penalty in Oregon is having a million conversations across the state. And you may, if you get your household to care about this issue, you're making progress. If you get someone in your workplace to care about this issue, you're making progress. You get folks at a church group, another community group to care about this issue, you're making progress. And so it's really all about finding that one thing that you can do to contribute to justice. And I hope that, folks can, the whole point of me sharing sort of the elements of myself is really that idea that you don't have to be an extraordinary person to do extraordinary things. And so I hope that the first step is the hardest, but hopefully I can inspire folks to have the courage to take that first step.
We're getting some great questions from our viewers, and I want to share a couple of those with you. And this is actually following along what you just said. Leslie wonders if there's currently an initiative in place to remove the death penalty in Oregon.
So we're looking at, so I'm a part of the group that is working on ending the death penalty in Oregon. And so we're looking at 2024 as the date for having an initiative on Oregon's ballot. And so between now and 2024 is when we're going to be working sort of to ramp this effort up. Looking to spend 2022 holding this sort of summit with Oregon leaders about sort of setting the course for what a 2-year plan to repeal the death penalty would look like, introducing a bill in the state legislature in 2023, and then really kicking off that campaign in 2024. But since 2024 is 2 years away, I want to flag for your viewers something that is still relevant and is still very much an initial step in this direction of historical repair. And that is on the 2022 Oregon ballot, there'll be an initiative about removing the clause except as punishment for a crime from Oregon's 13th Amendment, the clause that which most directly allowed slavery to evolve into convict leasing and then into the sort of form of mass incarceration that we see today. And so hoping to want to use that 2022 legislation as that first step in that introduction to the idea that we as a society and we as voters can make substantive changes to try and repair aspects of our history. And so keep an eye out for that. Follow the Oregon Remembrance Project on social media, and I'll keep you updated on both of those campaigns. And I hope that you can contribute to that, and we can sort of build this movement together over these next 2 years. I'll be giving a TED Talk at the Moda Center in May about this idea of how do you reconcile lynching, with the answer being to repeal our death penalty. And so a very tangible way is to share that video with your network. And so keep in touch, and I'll be able to help provide you with the avenues to share those informations.
Thank you. And again, I think it's important to remember that the history of the death penalty in the state of Oregon has been one of repeal and reinstatement, repeal, reinstatement. So the kind of substantive change that you're talking about is a very hard fought one, but I appreciate you cluing us in onto some of the things that are currently happening. We have another question about the current, let's see here. Do you have any comments about what Governor Brown is doing with clemency?
Yeah, I don't have a specific comment on sort of specific instances, but I do think that it's part of this movement towards reevaluating how our criminal justice system has operated in the past. That when we sort of had that swell of get tough on crime, large mandatory minimum sentences, that in doing so, one of the questions people ask me is like, so what changed? You went from wanting to be a tough on crime prosecutor to wanting to repeal the death penalty. What changed? And I think that my answer has been that I've always cared about justice. The only thing that's changed is my understanding of justice and understanding where there's injustice, and an understanding when we had that wave towards tough on crime prosecution and large mandatory sentences that we weren't actually achieving justice, and that accountability was found earlier in these sentences, and that where justice can happen is in potentially that transformation of people who can then go on and help impact their community. And so when we have these juveniles sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, we understand that the young brain changes over time, and that young people have the possibility to grow and change, and that they can be a benefit to society at 45, at 40, using their experiences to make impacts in the lives of those who are similar at their own age, and that they can actually be a benefit in addition to society, out with the rest of us, as opposed to sort of in prison. And that is the sort of accountability and justice that we really should be seeking, that ideal of transformational justice, where that we, how do we find justice for this horrible crime that happened 40 years ago? By that perpetrator changing who they are as a person, and then impacting those to try to prevent other young people from committing the same crimes. And so, at least for me, setting someone on that kind of life trajectory of transformation and eventual action is what justice looks like. And so, as we do this reevaluation of clemency in Oregon, I hope that those are sort of the perspective that we can bring to it.
Thank you. We have another question from Roger, is asking about how this topic intersects with other forms of injustice and our need to confront and change them, things like economic, educational injustice. Can you speak on that?
Yeah, I think that with any sort of aspect of historical injustice, at least, so what I tell people is the historical marker in Coos Bay has two dates of significance. 1902, when the lynching occurred, and then 2021, when the historical marker was unveiled, and that we can't fully understand the story of Alonzo Tucker only focusing on the 1902 date, as his story now continues on into 2020 and 2021, when the same community where his lynching occurred used his memory as inspiration for becoming a community more committed to these ideals of truth, justice, and reconciliation. And so how is this, this idea of truth and reconciliation relevant to other aspects of history? Is this idea that we can add more chapters to history. When I sort of went to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, I left feeling like that can't be it. This can't be the end of the story. And so when we look at, my next project is in Grants Pass, Oregon, having to do something regarding Grants Pass's history as a sundown town, with the goal of rewriting the ending to the story of a sundown town, to create an ending where a formerly exclusionary community can become one of the communities most intentionally committed to inclusivity because of their history. It's called the Sunrise Project, with the idea that sunrise is the opposite to sundown and signals the start of a new day. I'd love to say that it was my idea to use the word sunrise, but the idea came from a 69-year-old white male truck driver from Grants Pass. And so that's sort of what this work is about, and this general advancement of justice in our history is about, is bringing together ordinary people to do extraordinary things. And so as we added this new chapter to lynching in Oregon in Coos Bay, and we add this new chapter to sundown history in Grants Pass, I believe that idea of adding new chapters to history can be applied to many other arenas of historical injustice.
Well, Taylor, I think that's a great way to wrap up the evening. And I want to thank you again for joining us. And thanks everyone for being a part of our conversation tonight, both on Facebook and YouTube. And if you have any other questions or comments, please feel free to post them after the event. We do monitor those, and I'm happy to share any additional links as well. But follow the Oregon Remembrance Project on Instagram, follow them on Facebook, and please be sure to visit them online and stay up to date on the great work that they are doing and the great work that Taylor is doing here in the state. Taylor, again, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a great pleasure.
Yes, thank you for having me. And I always, I appreciate those of you who are watching. It is in and of itself the first step to be like, yes, I'm going to watch a presentation about lynching on Tuesday at 6:30 with like, could be watching basketball or Netflix, but you chose to do this. And so you've already taken that first step. And so I hope that you will reach out to me, or reach out to those in your life to take that next step, because you've already shown the courage of showing up today. And it's really that first step. And so I hope that you can sort of extend this advocacy for justice in your own life.
Great. Well, thank you all very much. Actually, we have one final question from Juliana. She's asking, is there somewhere we can follow your journey specifically?
So you will be able to find it on the Oregon Remembrance Project. I am still figuring out, this has all been a journey for me. When I graduated college, I was going to be a lawyer. And then I went to school, I got a master's of social work, and then no part of this would I ever be like, yes, I'm going to start a racial justice organization. And so this is, people ask me, well, like, how do you do all this? And you're like, honestly, I just figure this out as I go. And so I, welcome you to be a part of this journey with me. And as I get things, so what I tell people is the Oregon Remembrance Project is one individual, but that doesn't mean this has been an individual effort. And so meeting folks along this journey has been able to allow me to get to where I am now. And so I'm trying to do all these things, and I'm trying to get better at having more updates on social media. And so hopefully, as some of the administrative things settle down, I'll be able to do more storytelling in that fashion, and bring you along on this journey with me, because I may be doing this by myself, but I'm certainly not alone.
Great. Well, thank you again, Taylor, and thank you everybody for joining us here tonight at 6:30 on a Tuesday evening. We're more than happy to have you here, and we hope you'll join us again next week. So until then, good night, everybody, and be safe.